here? Okay, good. So the second talk title is Challenges and Strategies for Electricity Market Transition in China. What's your name?
Last name's
Lin. Okay, Jiang Lin. Okay, yeah, the podium is yours.
Do you know how to use this clicker? So it's just forward. You can use this the pointer. So forward.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to share our research. I thought this morning Professor Nocera captured our challenge quite well in terms of both the old world and new world, or the developed economy and emerging economies. And fortunately, China may be caught in between that. It's still somewhat of an emerging economy with many of its challenges, but it has built a very large legacy system, roughly 1,800 gigawatts capacity, including roughly 1,100 gigawatts of coal already, which need to go away at some time if we have to meet the challenge of stable climate in the future. So in terms of the emerging economy part, it doesn't actually have the so-called soft infrastructure for a very healthy electric power systems. As you may know, China is going through a radical experiment, changing from a planned dispatch system to a more market-driven system where both the hour generation and price will be determined by the market. So far, it's being set by government regulators in a so-called equal generation quota system. Essentially, all thermal generators get equal hour generation, regardless its efficiency and price. And Guangdong province, which is one of the largest provinces in China, just north of Hong Kong, and is being a vanguard in reforming in many respects. It also consumes roughly 1/10 of power in China. So it's actually a very good place to look at how this might work. It's also one of the first provinces that will run a real-time market pilot. And in fact, since last fall, they've been running the pilot market. In the last couple of weeks, it starts to settle and clear for the transaction as well. So there's a lot of interesting things we can look at. But this research was done at least 6 months ago, so we'll compare where we are. In many ways, this is not a new challenge what China is facing. Right? Transition to a market facing many obstacles. We feel that it's largely a political economy problem, not a technical problem at this point. And most of the debate are not supported by quantitative evidence to say one way or another. For one thing, it wasn't clear at all, as far as we can tell. Any research has been supporting the reform in quantifying what are the potential payoffs. Right? Everyone knows the risk of market. No one actually has articulated clearly what is the payoff in that. In our previous research published actually in Applied Energy, thank you, maybe 6 months ago, we identified a substantial economic benefit for reform. Roughly in Guangdong province alone, the wholesale market cost for power could decline by 27%. This is much larger than typically thought in terms of improving the efficiency of the power generation system. Typically by utilizing more efficient fleet than the inefficient one, you get 5 to 8% in efficiency gains. So here we're essentially identified a large mispricing set by regulators. And the consequence of the market reform, the revenue to generator is going to decline substantially. So the question in this paper will be, what are the impact transition to power market on coal power generating plant and each generating company who holds those plants? So we introduce essentially a financial term to evaluate whether each particular plant or corporate will stay afloat by looking at their operating profit, which is gross revenue, get to net revenue, minus some of the fixed costs, to say whether you have enough cash revenue to stay in business If not, essentially you have to be retired or mothballed or something else. We define 3 scenarios, including the base case scenario, modeling the current generation dispatch system. Essentially, all thermal coal plant, you have the same operating hours, and they are paid the benchmark tariffs. And there were 2 market scenarios. One's low price, one's high price. The low price scenario essentially roughly mirrors what happened in 2016. There's coal price roughly 800 yuan per ton of coal equivalent, and relatively high, good hydro generation hour conditions. In the high price scenarios, coal price go up, and there's less hydro generation, which drives the marginal cost a little higher. Here's capture roughly the Guangdong fleet, which is fairly new. Mostly over 60% of the fleet are 600 megawatts or bigger, built after 2010. There are roughly 30 companies in Guangdong province own all those generating assets. The 12 largest ones own 90% of installed coal capacity. A lot of them are provincially owned by provincial government, a few by the national government. Only I think 1 company is privately owned in those large holdings. Using traditional lending practice assumptions, we calculate the debt load for all the coal fleet in Guangdong province. They peak roughly around 2015, about 16 billion RMB per year in debt payments, but start to decline. If nothing changes, most of the debt, you can tell, are going to be paid off by 2030, 2032-ish, which will be an important point, because 2030 is the year that China has pledged major mitigation action under the Paris Agreement, roughly peak its emission by 2030 and achieve non-fossil energy consumption roughly 20% of its total prime energy use. So that gives you some indication of how potentially transition could happen in terms of time frame. Just give you sort of the context. China emit roughly 30% of global emissions, and power sector emits about 40% of China's emissions. So in the power sector alone, it's roughly 12 to 13% of global emissions, right? So decarbonizing this sector is important for decarbonizing global emissions, but also it leads to, through electrification, decarbonize all the other industry, transport, and building sector as well. Here is so-called a fixed cost curve by different capacity. You can see it's pretty flat throughout here. They have a fairly large, efficient fleet. Only sort of kicks up on the end because there's some smaller CHP plant at the end. So here are the results. We have under the current scenario, the benchmark, you can tell this is by capacity, this is by number of plants. Everyone makes very healthy profit, operating profit, except the last ones, right? And by different vintage plant, so that's why people were building a lot of coal plants in China, even after government has issued several policy guidance to stop, delay, or cancel new coal plants, and people are still building a fair amount. Because under the old system, you make quite a bit of money, and it's easy money to make. Here's what happens under a so-called market scenario. So this is by capacity. As you can tell, under the market scenario, roughly 60% of capacity won't make any operating profit. Or in terms of the number of companies, 80% of the coal plant will be losing money under this competitive market scenario. which poses an interesting question, right? And this is another way of showing it. Only the largest, newest plant can make a profit under the competitive market. Under so-called a high price scenario, when you have less hydro generation, higher coal prices, things are a little bit better. But still, you got 40% the capacity, 70% the plant are not going to make it. Right? So this leads to interesting challenges. And this is a chart we actually did a plan-by-plan chart, and showing this is the operating profit under the benchmark scenario. This is high price scenarios, this is low price scenarios. In the orange bars are the interest payment, and the gray bars are the principal debt payment. Right? So in some ways, as long as you can pay your interest, the bank don't really care. You can always refinance it, right? And so there are some solutions. But as you can tell, under the market, under the benchmark scenario, everyone's doing pretty well. But under the market scenarios, a lot of people are in trouble. Even the high price scenarios, roughly only 13% of the units, the coal units, can manage to make their interest payment. Right? Forget about the debt. Only 13% the power plant can make only interest payment. The rest could not. This is another way of looking at it, aggregating by the 12 largest holding companies in Guangdong. The bright orange are the current revenue scenario for them, and the gray is the high price scenario, and yellow are the low price scenario. The blue dots are the average debt interest that corporate owner holds. So, at the plant level, there's new plant, there's old plant. So you might imagine in the holding company, some might sort of even out in this market competitive scenario, but the situation is actually still fairly challenging. Roughly about 40% of the largest companies would have a negative operating income, which means the entire corporate, owners cannot pay, and nothing to pay for their debt servicing. Right? So this is posing a serious challenge in many ways, because even though China is building aggressively renewable energy plant, they're the largest market for solar, wind, etc. Many things are coming online. Probably not this fast yet. So you still need quite a bit the existing fleet to stay afloat, to keep the reliability, but also you don't want to keep paying the loss-making dirty plant forever. So that poses an interesting challenge for the policymakers and regulators. How do you design the future electricity market in China to keep those goals are consistent together? So I won't repeat the conclusion here, but largely that the coal fleet, because the efficiency is fairly efficient, and the most plant actually will be out in the market. For gas, this is especially true. Natural gas, as several speakers mentioned already, were largely imported. The price of natural gas on a heat content basis are probably 3 to 4 times higher than the ones in the US. And they are clearly not going to be competitive economically, even for peaker purposes, right? This is another challenge for the whole system reliability concern. So as we identified that only roughly 20% of the coal unit are able to pay their going forward costs. And even in the high price scenarios, only 2 companies can stay afloat. So the question really is, I wouldn't go into this detail here, the 2 really issues for regulators in Guangdong need to think about. Right? In the short term, there's a transition issue to consider, because you still need a lot of old fleet to be around to support system reliability and demand growth, but also in long term, you need to figure out a new way of paying for new capacity as well. So those two mechanisms has to be designed in consideration, so you don't create a short-term solution, but preclude the long-term solution for both reliable, clean, and efficient power systems, right? So there are a lot of lessons we can learn from similar issue in the U.S., which in fact is actually not very positive. A lot of coal plants are coming under economic pressure in the U.S. However, more or less, we're paying them off with ratepayer money. And that's kind of a questionable solution. If we truly want to support clean power system transition, not paying off the dirty old plants. This one, which I think are still debatable, whether the capacity market is the right ideal solution for China at this point. We don't know yet, but the energy market has been launched already. We'll see how they evolve. But the two design issues actually are interlinked, and that to truly for new technology come online while maintain system reliability is really a market design challenge. So let's stop right there.
Okay, thank you for the interesting analysis. So we have a couple of minutes for questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Frank Holder from Rutgers University. What's the price clearing mechanism in China? In other words, how is a generation unit paid when it's operating? Is it paid?
So under the traditional system, you have an annual planning session. You are guaranteed an hour operation for your units, right? So the system dispatcher will do their reliability, security constraint dispatch. You'll be settled for whatever you generated, and the so-called benchmark tariff, which are set by government.
So that's not market-based?
No. So most are not. So now they're introducing the market system essentially as an economic dispatch. So the marginal price clearing price are being just tried out actually since this month for the first time, but not all the days. They have a couple of days they actually cleared. So that's transitioning, and more the total generation will be put under the market system. But how fast that's happening is unclear yet.
Under the market system, not the old system, under the market system, the generation unit that you want, when it runs in an hour, is it paid a single clearing price, a rotational marginal clearing price? What is the price it is paid?
So I believe in Guangdong, I have to double check on that. I think it's a nodal pricing because there's a lot of local congestion within Guangdong. Yeah.
Okay, no more question. Yeah, go ahead.
Come from Beijing Institute of Technology. I'm majoring in energy economics and technology. And thank you for your presentation, and I have a question about
Okay, speak a little loud.
Oh, okay.
I'm here.
Thank you for your presentation, and I have one question. Your research really focused on the coal generators. And what's your opinion about the role of renewable energy or distributed power to the China's electricity market reform, or the impact of the reform on these generators?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I would say there's both a short-term answer and a long-term answer, right? The short-term answer is that most renewable energy generators are paid a so-called feed-in tariff right now. So they're still protected under that. So they are not part, they're part of the dispatch, but the price are paid on according to whatever they signed up already in terms of their feed-in tariff, or if it's competitively procured at a PPA price. So they're not being given this market clearing price so far. In terms of long term, I think there's a great promise for renewable energy to take a much higher share than is currently available in China. Right now, it's only about 5% solar wind together. But when you get to a very high share of renewable power, how everyone get paid really need to be rethought together, because essentially you have zero cost power coming online more and more. The price are always near the floor, and that's not a viable business model in the long term. So the market rule has to be designed differently. That's why one of the lessons we want to share is that don't solve the problem for today, solve the problem for the future. So whatever regulatory structure put in place, you need to think about how future systems may behave.
So good. Let's thank the speaker again.